Hi, welcome. I'm Craig, and I'm joined here by Kathy. And today we're going to be talking about church history. So we're going to sort of go through the timeline of the church from the first century up to the present. We're just going to give a very brief overview, touching on some of the main points, some of the main things that happened throughout church history. And so we're going to mostly fly through it, but hopefully we'll touch on enough things to give everyone a decent idea of what went on throughout church history. So let's start with prayer. Our Father in heaven, thank you for all that you do for us, and we just ask that you guide us as we go through this timeline and get a better understanding of how things have happened from the time of Jesus until now, and some of the major events and circumstances and developments that have occurred throughout church history. So just pray for your guidance. We pray this in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so the timeline of church history, and the first part is the first, second, and third centuries. And I think in future meetings, we can sort of spend more time on first and second century Christianity. That's what I've been spending most of my time focusing on. So that's what I'm most knowledgeable about. But we're just going to kind of fly through that and focus primarily on everything after the second century today, just to kind of give us a framework of how that connects to the first and second centuries. All right, so the first thing, we have the Bible, all the Bible narratives that sort of occur in the first 60 or so years. Even if the things might have been written afterwards, they're describing events that occurred in the first 60 or so years. And so then once we're beyond the times of what's written in the Bible, then we get to Nero. He is the emperor, and basically he did some persecuting. He was not very amenable to Christians. And it says here, Christians on fire at his parties, blamed Christians for the Great Fire of Rome, and some other things. And so there were, and it's hard to tell sort of how much of this is things that absolutely happened historically and how much of it is just Eusebius or Tacitus maybe embellishing some things. But we have a few different historical accounts that describe things that happened. And so we just kind of have to, decide how true might this be. I don't know. But I think overall, some of the things that happen a little bit later, we can be more clear because we have better records. But we know that Nero apparently was not super fond of Christians, though. And then 70 AD was kind of the major event, the first major event that's recorded in sort of post-biblical times, and that's the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, where there was a sort of a revolt against Roman occupation by the Jewish people, and that resulted in a backlash where Rome came and sent military, and they basically destroyed the temple and destroyed most of the city, and it was a lot of bloodshed. Not a great time. And then the next major thing that occurred was what's known as the Bar Kokhba revolt. And that was basically similar to the first one, but even more devastating in terms of the resulting consequence, where basically there was, again, sort of a Jewish revolt against Roman occupation. But this time it resulted in the entire city of Jerusalem being destroyed and all the people living there basically being cast out. And so that was a major turning point in basically Jewish history and also Christian history, because at this point, especially in the first century, Christianity is primarily a Jewish thing. There are, I guess what you would say, like Gentile Christians, but it's like its focus. I keep getting messages. I need to turn that off. But it's basically largely Jewish. So these events that are major to Jewish history are also major to Christian history at this point. Does that make sense?
You said the Jewish and the Christian history are pretty much running along the same lines at this point.
Yeah, like these things that are like these are two of the biggest events that occur in Jewish history in this time period, and it has a big effect on Christian history as well, because of how closely related the two are at this point.
Right, they're still pretty much related. Yeah, they don't split off until later, so they're still pretty much running. They're still pretty much one group of people, more or less. Is that it, or?
Yeah, like there's the Christian churches, especially as we'll find later, it's the term is later called the Ebionites, but basically this Jerusalem church, this original sort of movement, is oftentimes referred to as a sect of Judaism at this point. And so it's seen as like part of Judaism, and it's like beginning to split off in the second century. And then once we get to like the mid to late second century, is when we see some more marked breaks between the two. But I just wanted to kind of point out that at this stage in church history, it's very much still connected to Judaism. So these major events that affect uh, Judaism and they also very much affect the early Christian movement.
Okay, I get it.
So then, and if you have any questions or anything you want to say, just stop me as I'm going. Okay. Any clarification or whatever. So then once we get to the second century, especially the middle of the second century, and this is where it's still kind of really fuzzy to kind of piece together exactly what's going on in the early part of the second century. But once you get to like the mid to late second century, there's a lot, you start to get better and better records, more attestations of things. We have more documents that are preserved. We could read the literature of what's going on. And so we start to get a much better picture of what Christianity looks like once we get to like the end of the second century. And so one thing that we see is we don't see one unified Christian movement. Instead, what we see in the middle to late second century is that we have a handful or maybe even several groups that are sort of identified with certain key people in each of those particular groups. And so you have sort of multiple versions of Christianity that are distinct in some ways, but then similar in other ways. So one group is what's called the Marcionites, another one the Valentinians, another one the Ebionites, the Sethians, and some other forms of Christianity exist, including the emerging proto-Orthodoxy. So Marcionites are those who are basically following Marcion of Sinope, and they're using sort of an earlier version of the Gospel of Luke. The main difference is that it doesn't have the birth narrative attached to it yet, but basically they're using Paul's canon, using Paul's letters, and an early version of the Gospel of Luke. You have the Valentinians, who are very much in the Johannine camp. So when we look at the Gospel of John, like a lot of that material that is very Johannine, you know, the parts of the Gospel of John that feel very much different from the synoptic Gospels, like Matthew, Mark, and Luke, those aspects are like Valentinian, Johannine sort of things, like all the I am sayings and this very kind of spiritualized version of the gospel. And then you have the Ebionites, which are originally under James, and they're the ones that actually go back to the apostles. And so they're very much focused on like ethics and righteousness and like doing the will of God. And so they're not so much concerned with like maybe the spiritual metaphysics that the Valentinians are concerned with. And they're not as concerned with what Paul has to teach, like the Marcionites are, but the Ebionites are more concerned with like James and the ethical teachings of Jesus. And then you have the Sethians, who are typically seen as like now all these, not the Ebionites, but like the Marcionites, the Valentinians, and the Sethians are often referred to under the same umbrella as Gnostics, but scholars tend to sort of shy away from that term now because we have better, more precise terms and ways of distinguishing between these groups, especially now that we have all the texts in Nag Hammadi. So we have a better idea of what all these groups looked like instead of just lumping them all into some blanket category. But now the Sethians are very much concerned with like gnosis, which is knowledge. So you want to have this kind of self-knowledge, but then they also have this sort of elaborate metaphysical framework where you have all these like eons, and it gets a little complicated, but they kind of have their own metaphysic. And one thing that's sort of I think that they were the originators of this idea was that sort of the God of the Old Testament was like an evil deity. And then the Marcionites also sort of adopted a similar view. But it's unclear whether they thought it was the Old Testament conception of God or whether they actually thought the God of the Old Testament was an evil creator of the world, that like some evil God created the world. So that's, I think, up for debate, but the Sethians definitely had this sort of alternate view. And they're also sometimes called Ophites, which Ophidian, like a serpent. And so they would, they basically believed that it was good that we ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil and listened to the serpent because like things were better for us. And the reason that they are called the Sethians is because they identify as the seed of Seth. So Seth is that child of Adam. And so they believe that they're like this righteous seed. And so they had this view of like the children of God will be revealed, and that those are the seeds of Seth. And so the Sethians are like the righteous heirs to the promise or something along those lines. So if we ever decide to look at some of the Nag Hammadi texts, I could share with you some of the things that the Sethians and the Valentinians believed. And then, of course, you don't have to go far to find out what the Marcionites believed. You just look at Paul's letters in the Gospel of Luke. And then for the Ebionites, you'd have to dig into some of the early material, like you have the Clementine literature, and you have like they have Hebrew Matthew, which was known as the Gospel of the Hebrews, but we don't have that. We can only sort of piece that together through reconstructing it. But
You don't
basically,
have it? You mean that book has been destroyed? We don't have that book anymore? Is that it?
correct. We
Okay.
we don't have a manuscript of that text anymore, and we don't know exactly what it said. We only can piece it together through attestations where people are quoting from it, and those texts that quote from it survive. But we can also piece it together in a major way through just reconstructing all the history of the movement and the texts that surround it. And so, for instance, like with the discovery of the Gospel of Thomas, that was a huge discovery because then we can compare the passages that have parallels from the Gospel of Thomas to what they call the Q source, and then with like in the Synoptic Gospels, like Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where things that correlate with Thomas, that they are much more likely to be from the Gospel of the Hebrews source. And so that was one of the major discoveries that helped us to reconstruct that source, but it has yet to be reconstructed in its full form. So that's just kind of a very brief overview of kind of what's going on with the different forms of Christianity. I think the major thing to keep in mind at this point is that contrary to what a lot of people might think, if they're just doing this like sort of cursory overview of church history, especially from whatever denomination you're in, they might think, well, we've always been the true church. And so the true church has always been unified from Jesus to the apostles into the 2nd century. And then whatever branch they identify with, they'll just be like, and then they continued on in that way. But if you actually look at the history, it wasn't like that. There were multiple groups that had different beliefs and practices from each other in the 2nd century.
So proto-orthodoxy means like prototype, so the beginning of orthodoxy, right? So the prototype to it, the prototype to Christianity or Orthodox Christianity. So I have a question on Judaism and Christianity. So at one point, Judaism, God was using the Jewish people throughout the Old Testament. So what's the split here? Is it because is it because of the differences? Some believe that Jesus was the Son of God and some didn't. Is that why there's a split? Or, I mean, I've never really understood exactly why Judaism just isn't Christianity, really.
Well, it's definitely a complicated question, and I don't think there's a single answer as to why. But I think some of the major differences that emerged. One, like you said, some were identifying Jesus as the Messiah, and others were rejecting that. And I think if you just go to a typical church, they'll say, well, that's the reason. They just rejected that Jesus was
That's
the
what I've
Messiah.
heard. Yeah. But I know it's more complicated than that, but I've never gotten an explanation.
Yeah, it's a lot more complicated than that. And I can offer you some more details about it, but I'm not going to be able to give you the answer to that because I don't think there is one answer. But some other relevant factors to consider is that a lot of these early Christians, even as we get into like the second and third century, they were still observing the Jewish festivals with the other Jewish people that have families that were Jewish. They would identify as Jewish. They would be like, yeah, I'm Jewish and I believe Jesus was the Messiah. And that wouldn't be some like weird thing. Whereas like today, you'd be like, well, then you're not really Jewish if you believe in Jesus. It's like, well, that wasn't the mindset here. But then there was some backlash where there's this saying within Judaism at that time where it's like they would push away with their left hand and pull in with their right, and so they were like pushing away with both hands, and this was in reference to this thing called reciting the blessing, which actually was more like a curse, but they called it a blessing, where they would have people, they would pick out people from the congregation within the synagogue to say these blessings. And if somebody was a believer in Jesus, once they got to this final blessing that was added, it was something like, cursed be all those who believe, like who follow Jesus. And so then if you say that blessing, then you're pronouncing a curse on yourself and fellow believers. And if you won't say it, then you've sort of outed yourself as a believer in Jesus. And so that was one thing that was, according to some historical sources, and this is mostly preserved from like the Jewish side, where like that's sort of how the split, part of what may have contributed to that split. But then as we look at some of the things that were going on with the political landscape, it becomes clear that there were reasons politically why different Christian groups would want to uh, sort of not identify as Jewish anymore. And so it definitely is a more complicated thing than just saying, well, they rejected the Messiah and the other ones didn't. And like that was the split. Because that really wasn't the split, because they were still largely in fellowship for centuries later. And so it is a more of a complicated thing that I think developed over time. But also from the Christianity side, as these other forms of Christianity emerged that started seeing like the God of Judaism as basically an evil deity instead of as like the father of Jesus, like, of course, how would you identify as Jewish if that's your belief? And so there were these like things that were going on from like the Christianity side where they were intentionally trying to distance themselves as well. I don't know if that helped clarify or just made it even less difficult, less easy to understand.
No, it gives me more. And I didn't think it was as straightforward as well. All of a sudden, there's two groups, and one believes in Christ as the deity and one doesn't. And, just like with most things, it's way more complicated than that.
Mm-hmm. And we see things even within the Christianity, where these different versions of Christianity in the 2nd century, they would be, and this is, you asked about the proto-orthodoxy. The term is typically used for the early heresiologists, which would be like Irenaeus, and I guess Tertullian kind of counts, not really. But then you get Epiphanius later and a few other people, where they would write these books that were basically saying, this is what we believe against what all these other groups believe. So they basically be saying, these are all the other groups, and here's why they're all wrong, and why we're the ones who are right. And so then that's how they would basically say, well, we think, for instance, the Ebionites are wrong. They're a bunch of vegans that believe in keeping the Torah. They're like too Jewish, and like we don't believe in any of that nonsense. It's like, well, actually, the Ebionites were Jesus and the apostles. So if you think that they're heretics, you just call Jesus and the apostles heretics. But it's like, that's what they did. And that's what sort of all these groups were doing, or at least that's what the proto-orthodoxy sort of established itself as. So they were kind of decidedly a non-Jewish version of Christianity once that started to emerge. And so once proto-orthodoxy sort of took over and became kind of the dominant form of Christianity, and they were decidedly, by their own decision, not Jewish, then that was sort of like, well, I mean, the break has kind of been made at that point. But we have the Marcionites also holding that same view, as far as I can tell, where they sort of identified as non-Jewish, where the Ebionites identified as Jewish. And it's a little unclear to me with the Sethians and Valentinians, some of the other groups. All right, so anything else, or we can move on to Justin?
Sorry, yes, we can move on. I keep muting myself and forgetting.
Okay, so Justin, he's a really important source in history because we have two of his major works. One is the First Apology, and the other one is the Dialogue with Trypho. And as far as his theology, it's like, okay, cool. Like, this is what he's suggesting in his works are probably representative, maybe representative of what people in Rome, Christians in Rome, were believing at that time. But I think what's more important from Justin's works is he is the earliest reliable attestation to what documents were in existence at his time. So, for instance, he was getting his entire birth narrative from the infancy gospel of James. And so that, because of Justin, we basically know that, and of course, not all scholars agree with this, but I'm pretty convinced based on the evidence that basically that was the source text for the first two chapters of Matthew and Luke. So that's where they get the birth narrative from. And we only know that because Justin, because he says Jesus was born in a cave, and all the other quotes come from that. And then he's also using what he calls the memoirs of the apostles. So this is before we have things like, they say, well, this is the Gospel of Luke, or this is the Gospel of Mark, or the Gospel of Matthew, or whatever. And so he's like, these are memoirs. And the only one that he names is there's a memoir of Peter, because Peter identifies himself. And so and based on the quotes that he gives, it seems clear to me that he's using a Greek translation of the Gospel of Hebrews. And so he probably doesn't have Matthew or Luke, but he's using this Gospel of the Hebrews, which is basically a Hebrew version of the Gospel of Matthew, but it also doesn't have a birth narrative, and it has some other changes as well, some other differences. But Justin, he's a really good witness to a lot of the texts that were in existence. So it's a really good resource for reconstructing the textual history of which, like what sources or what texts use what as their sources. And so that's why Justin, I think, is primarily valuable. But he's also considered one of the first heresiologists. So he's considered like one of the fathers of the proto-orthodoxy. So he's an important figure in church history on his own, but he's also super important to people trying to do source criticism, which is one of the things that I'm focused on. So it's really important for me. So now you know everything there is to know about Justin. We can move on to Irenaeus.
Okay.
Unless you have a question about Justin.
No, I don't. I have heard him quoted from other theologians and teachers. Like, I always bring up Greg Boyd. I've heard him talk about Justin Martyr and others like in that camp that have talked about him too. Roger Olson too has talked about him. I don't know that much about him, but I know more about him from you than I do them, actually. So,
well, his last name isn't Martyr. He's just known as Justin Martyr because he was martyred. But his name is Justin.
Do we know his last name?
I don't think there really were last names. They would say like, this is the guy's name and this is where he's from. And
Okay.
so, like for instance, Irenaeus, they'd say Irenaeus of Lyon, which Lyon was basically France at that time.
So how was Justin martyred?
It's a good question. I'm not remembering offhand, but I know that there were a lot of Christians who were martyred in Rome, and so he was one of those Roman Christians that eventually was martyred. It was one of those kind of things that I think he sort of willingly did it, where he didn't like resist being martyred.
Was he Roman? Was he?
I don't think he was. I don't think he was born in Rome. I think he was born in Syria, under Greek parents. But then he moved to Rome later on, and that's where he did most of his ministry.
Okay.
All right, so now Irenaeus, he's one of the most important figures in early church history for a few reasons. One is because he wrote the most extensive heresiology that we have intact. Justin claims to have written one, but we don't have it. But usually what these heresiologists do is they'll take the previous persons and just add to it. So today we call that plagiarism, but in that time, that's just how it worked. And so when we look at Irenaeus against heresies, there's a good chance that Justin was actually the one who wrote that and that Irenaeus just added things to it. And we don't know how much of it Irenaeus added on and how much of it was originally Justin, but that's one of the theories. So the against heresies of Irenaeus is super important because it's one of our earliest sources that gives us information about all these other groups like the Marcionites, Valentinians, Ebionites, Sethians, etc. So he plays a very important role from, again, a source critical perspective to try to piece together, like, where do all these manuscripts belong to? Like, we have this Nag Hammadi library, and it's like, well, like, whose texts are these? What are the groups that were using these and developing these and writing these? And so he's attesting to a lot of them. And then even if he's not attesting to a particular work, he'll describe the group and what they believe. And so you're like, oh, well, this text is clearly, promulgating that sort of doctrine. And so that's probably what he's referring to here. So he's a really valuable source for that in terms of piecing together what second century Christianity looked like. But he's also really important as a figure on his own, because there's one thing that he did that today is like we're continuing to do that throughout the church today. And that is, he was the first to establish the gospel canon, where he says Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the four gospels, and that's his gospel canon. And that's today, if you look at your Bible, there's four gospels, and it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So it was probable that, at least with Matthew and Luke, sometime maybe 20 years before him was when those were finally finished. Like, I think that's when they had their birth narratives added onto them and whatever other changes. And so it wasn't long thereafter before Irenaeus was like, these are the four, all those other gospels that exist, and there are several other ones that were floating around: Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Judas, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Truth, all these other gospels. And he's like, these are the four that we're going to consider authoritative, and none of the other ones. And that's stuck since then.
Do we still have the other ones? The other ones that didn't, that weren't considered the gospel canon, like the Gospel of Mary? And do we still have those?
Yeah, we have probably about a dozen other ones. I know we have the Infancy James, Infancy Thomas, with Gospel of Mary. We have two different versions of Mary, I think. We have the Infancy Thomas and Thomas now. We have the Gospel of Truth. We have Gospel of Judas. And I think we have a few other ones as well. So yeah, we have a lot of those now. A lot of those were discovered in the Nag Hammadi library. And that was a discovery within the last century. So that was one of the most important discoveries in archaeological discoveries for church history.
And you and I have gone through a couple of those: Gospel of Thomas, Infancy Gospel.
Yep.
I think
and the Gospel of Infancy James as well.
And James, yeah, Infancy James, we did those. Okay.
So that's Irenaeus. And then next guy that's kind of worth mentioning is Tertullian. And Tertullian wrote against Marcion, and he wrote Apologeticus. And basically he was one of the major early proponents of the Trinity doctrine. So I think it was Athanasius who described God as like 3 in 1, but the third wasn't the Holy Spirit, it was the wisdom of God. And then Tertullian was the first one to actually use the word Trinity, or whatever the corollary is in Latin for that, but like calling God a Trinity. So that was one of the things that stuck from Tertullian. But he had some things that were backwards. Like he thought that Marcion basically took the Gospel of Luke and took a bunch of stuff out that he didn't like. But now that we sort of have all this, we can sort of reconstruct Marcion's gospel, and we compare it with all these like data linguistic techniques. It's quite clear that Tertullian had that backwards, that actually Marcion was using an earlier form of the Gospel of Luke, and that the canonical version just had stuff added to it. So Tertullian probably has some other things backwards as well, but he's also considered sort of one of these major early proto-Orthodox people. So Irenaeus I would consider to be like, in my view, he's like the beginning of the proto-Orthodoxy, but I could see someone saying Justin was also in that camp. But I would say with Irenaeus saying this is the gospel canon, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that was like the major development that I would say was the beginning of the proto-Orthodoxy. And Tertullian followed him, basically. And then we have Origen. He was teaching at the School of Alexandria. So Christianity was spreading quite a bit in the 2nd century, and it was spreading in the 1st century too. We have that with Paul's letters, where he was traveling all over the Roman Empire, but it continued to spread and take root. We have not just churches springing up everywhere, but we also had schools springing up. We had like a school in Carthage, a school in Alexandria, a school in Antioch. And so in the 3rd century, we had a bunch of schools as well as churches. Then just to kind of wrap up some stuff in the 3rd century, there's Emperor Gallienus, which I think I spelled that, I don't know how to spell that, issued the edict welcoming Christians to worship without persecution. So there's a lot of persecution before this point, but then as we'll see, there's sort of a lot of back and forth when it came to times of persecution and times of not persecution. And of course, which group that you fell under, whether you were considered a Christian or not, had a lot to do with whether these things were benefiting you or hurting you. Then just another major point was that there's ascetic monasticism became prevalent in the 4th century under St. Anthony the Great of Egypt. So this ascetic monasticism is basically like we see today, like monasteries where people are basically, they take these vows of celibacy. Usually they involve some sort of self-constraint. Uh, that's what asceticism would be, where you're denying yourself certain things. And they would basically live these contemplative lives where they're meditating, trying to have this like uh, relationship with God and connect with God
Mhm.
on a personal level. And so that became really big in the fourth, fifth, and sixth centuries.
Like the Catholic monks and things like that today, kind of
Mm-hmm.
kind of like that, similar.
Yep.
Okay.
And this wasn't the beginning. This is when it sort of exploded, especially in Egypt. But this was going on even like in the first century and even BC. There were Jewish groups that were living monastic lives. We have like the Essenes, which were a very sort of monastic community group. So this wasn't something new, but this is just another major thing that was occurring in Egypt at the time.
Okay.
So, any questions about the first 3 centuries of Christianity?
No.
All right, so now in fourth century Christianity, this is where we kind of have what I would, if you don't say that the Proto Orthodoxy began in like Irenaeus time, then you definitely would say the Proto Orthodoxy sort of took root in the fourth century. But usually the distinction between Proto Orthodoxy and Orthodoxy is Proto Orthodoxy is like Irenaeus time, but now the Orthodoxy would be in the fourth century.
Okay.
So in the early fourth century, we have Emperor Diocletian. He ordered Christianity to stop and their books burned, wanted Rome to revert back to pagan polytheism. So here we had persecution coming from an emperor who was like, this rise of Christianity is threatening the pagan polytheism of the empire. So we want to go back to our Greco-Roman gods. And so he's trying to get rid of Christianity and burn their literature. And today you might think, well, what was the like burning books? Like, what does that accomplish? You just print out more books or you have it saved on your computer. But back then, you don't have any of those things. In order to make a copy of a book, you have to sit down and transcribe the entire thing by hand or hire a scribe to do that. And if it was a long book, like, if we're talking about, I mean, the Bible wasn't the Bible at this point, but they started to have codexes and they would have scrolls. And this is like a long process to try to transcribe these texts. And it was expensive material too. You wouldn't just go to the store and buy, a packet of notebook paper that they printed off in a factory or produced in a factory. Instead, you had to like produce the paper, which was a long process. So these are expensive materials and time consuming to write books. And so to burn all their books and scrolls, this was like a major setback for a lot of groups. I know you were saying that your mom was very interested in this topic, right?
Mm-hmm. This time period. Yep.
So that wasn't the only time where there was burning books. And we'll talk about a couple other times in the same century, but that was one of the early ones in the fourth century. And that was coming from an emperor who wanted to bring back Greco-Roman polytheism. So next is the Edict of Sardica. And this was under Galerius, probably pronouncing that wrong as well. But this one was more like toleration of Christianity. So this was like, okay, well, this is good now. So there's this sort of backlash where they're burning all our books. And now it's like, let's stop doing that. Let's be tolerant of them. So it's like, okay, now there's this reprieve. But then in 312 to 323, this is when Constantine supposedly converts from Greco-Roman polytheism to what's typically referred to as Nicene Christianity. And so just to give you a little bit of a backstory on Constantine, I'm not an expert on him, but his story is basically that he was fighting this battle and he had this vision of Christ when he was in the battle, and he saw this figure and he was like, Christ is going to win me the battle. And so he like put that symbol that he saw, which was like, I think a cross and maybe some other figure in the symbol. like on his shields and on his armor. And he won the battle, and he believes that it was because like Christ won him that battle, and like now like he's supposed to be a Christian, so he forsakes the Greco-Roman polytheism that he was previously practicing, and now he becomes a Christian. So there's really not any record of him practicing the values that Jesus taught that his followers should practice. It seems like it was more of like he was going to politically align himself with like this religious affiliation. Um, and so now when he's going to fight his battles, instead of doing it in the names of the Greco-Roman gods, he's doing it in the names of Jesus, in the name of Jesus. So you can make of that what you want, but he's a very important figure because, and we'll get to that with the Council of Nicaea, but I just want to kind of point that out, that he had this conversion, or at least he calls it his conversion, but it's more of just now the Roman military under Constantine is identifying itself as Christian.
Right. But it's still the Roman Empire, is still the political system at that time, which is he's not really converting to follow Jesus. It sounds to me like he is converting Jesus to be his warrior figure in a sense.
Yeah, that's definitely one perspective that people have who are, I guess, Constantine skeptics.
Yeah, I'm a Constantine skeptic. I learned a bit about him again when Greg Boyd, he taught a little bit about this time. I took some classes and stuff at Woodland Hills Church, at his church. So I learned a little bit about this period of time and about him in particular. That's my impression of him.
Yep. Okay, so then next we have the Edict of Milan, and this is ordered by Constantine, and it was legalizing the practice of Christianity and all other religions, protecting Christians from persecution. So the Edict of Milan is one of these rare cases where it seems like pretty much everyone benefits, no matter what religion you are, where he wasn't saying Christians can gain toleration, but we persecute the Jews, or as we saw with Diocletian, we have the Greco-Roman polytheism benefits, but then the Christians are get the shorthand. And so here it was like Edict of Milan, basically freedom of religion to practice whatever religion you want. But that didn't last very long. So then we have the Council of Nicaea in 325, and this is, a lot of people would consider this the major turning point in church history. Now, if you had to say like what are the handful of biggest events that occurred like in post-biblical times in church history, like if the Council of Nicaea doesn't make your list of top 5, then I don't know why. I think it pretty much makes everyone's top 5, and a lot of people put it as top 1. So the Council of Nicaea, one of the significant things about this, it was ordered by Emperor Constantine, and it was to determine the official church beliefs. Now, Constantine wasn't the one determining the beliefs. By all accounts, and we have quite a few good records of what occurred, it seems like it was all the bishops of all the different churches were all called together to basically agree on what was going to be official Christianity. And Emperor Constantine, as far as I can tell, didn't really care what they decided. All he cared about is that they all would come to an agreement on what they believed. So then he could say, this is the official belief of Christianity. And now everyone who doesn't believe this thing that we all agreed Christianity is, they're all heretics and we can persecute them. So if you don't conform to the thing that everyone agrees Christianity is, you're now an outsider. And so Constantine was like, I don't care what you guys decide on, just decide on something so we can pick what real Christianity is. So that's one part of it. Another part of it is that this sets a precedent that the emperor is able to call councils. So now basically the emperor is the one running the church. So before you had all the bishops who are running the churches, and now we have Constantine basically determining, calling these councils for the bishops to decide on things that he wants them to decide on. So this was, I would say, the point where the church, which was separate from the state prior to this point, or the churches, whatever you would want to call Christianity at this point, but now here is where it becomes a unified thing and becomes married to the state under the emperor.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a major development in church history, and that's why most people would refer to the church prior to 325 as pre-Nicene Christianity, or what's sometimes referred to as anti-Nicene, but I think that anti meaning before, sometimes people think anti meaning like against. So anti with an E, not with an I, anti-Nicene Christianity, and then post-Nicene Christianity comes afterwards.
Okay. Politics and the church get married.
Unfortunately, this was definitely a big thing. So then, let's see, that was 325. Now, 5 years later, 330, Constantine split the Roman Empire into two parts. You have the Western Latin-speaking half with the Rome as its capital, and an Eastern Greek-speaking half known as the Byzantine Empire, with Constantinople, named after Constantine, as its capital. By this time, the four main churches were supposedly Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. So this was a major thing that occurred where basically it was all the Roman Empire, but now the Roman Empire split into two, where you have the Western and the Eastern. And this is going to be relevant for church history too, because the Byzantine Empire, where Constantinople is their capital, that's what's going to become the Greek Orthodox Church, and then the Rome as like the capital, that's going to be the like the Roman Catholic Church later on. So this was the sort of the beginning of that.
The beginning. So why did they split? Did they have some disagreement so they split? So there were some differences, or did he just decide to spread it around to these cities and just have these locations, four main churches?
So he didn't determine that these were the four main churches. This is just apparently what was the case at this point. He decided to split the Roman Empire into East and West.
Okay, based on Latin and based on Greek. So that was the splitting division, a Latin and a Greek. Okay.
Yeah, it wasn't necessarily because of the language, but yeah, like the language was a big part of it. I'm not like up on like the history of the, I'm not a historian in that sense. I'm only interested in the history as it relates to the church. But my understanding is that it was like the Roman Empire was sort of too big at this point for him to sort of run it by himself. So he kind of split it into two, and Constantinople kind of became the sort of second version. So it was like West Rome and East Rome was like the Byzantine Empire.
Okay.
But I just wanted to mention that Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome were kind of the ones who were big at this point. So then we have under Emperor Gratian, Christianity gains legally protected status. I don't have much to say about that. It's just something that happened. And then in 380 was the Edict of Thessalonica. This was another major thing that occurred. So under Emperor Theodosius, Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire, supplanting Rome's pagan gods. He ordered the Edict of Thessalonica, rendering all other forms of Christianity heretical and illegal, and confiscating their property, including their literature. So this was, remember, at the beginning of the 4th century, we had a sort of book burning from an emperor who was wanting Greco-Roman polytheism to supplant Christianity, and so he's persecuting all the Christian believers by burning their books. Now we have under Emperor Theodosius something very similar happening, except at least as far as a lot of forms of Christianity are concerned. But this is not affecting the Nicene form of Christianity, because remember, this is rendering all other forms of Christianity heretical. So it becomes the official religion of Rome. So now they're like, if you're not conforming to the version of Christianity that's yoked to the political powers of the state, then you are deemed a heretic, and we're confiscating your literature and burning it. And I don't know how much, to what extent these punishments were enacted, but in this edict, it was punishable by death. That if you don't hand over your literature to be burned, then basically we find you with the literature, we can then kill you. It can be punishable by death, very severe punishment. Now, again, if they found people with the literature, I don't know if they actually did kill them or not, or if they were just like, hey, we'll take your literature now from you or what. But it was apparently they wanted it to be harsh punishment if you don't hand over your literature to be burned. And one of the things that we know about this that was really interesting, and that we know that it was a real historical thing that occurred, is because we have all these records within the church where they would be referring to people who would give over the literature to be burned as traitors. And so then after these people gave up the literature to be burned to like save their own necks or whatever, then later they would try to rejoin the churches, and there was this big sort of disagreement on like, well, these people who handed over our sacred texts to be burned, should we allow these people to come back into our church, or should we be like, no, you're a traitor, like you're not allowed back in? So that was a big thing that was going on at this time. And so there were people who were like guarding these sacred texts basically with their life, quite literally, because they were so important. And so these forms of Christianity that were refusing to marry themselves to this, state-run version of Christianity, there was all this sort of internal difficulty with how to deal with people who would succumb versus the ones who would guard these texts with their life. You have any questions about that?
No. Tragic.
It's a miracle any of it survived, right?
Yeah, act of God, I'm sure.
An act of people who are willing to do everything they can to preserve that literature. That's where a lot of these groups, they kind of were more or less underground at this point, because you couldn't really be above ground and just out in the open reading your sacred texts, because they're like, well, we're going to come by and take these from you and burn them. So you'd have to meet secretly in houses and things like that.
Yeah. I'm sure God empowered this somehow. I mean, I can't see where without his intervention that this would. It's not to get us off track. It's that idea of the Bible not being inerrant, but being infallible. It will survive. It will reach its goal, sort of thing. So that's.
Well, we haven't got to a Bible yet. That comes 17 years later. So we'll get to that in a second. The formation of the Bible canon.
But this is all part of it, right? So, I mean, without this material, we wouldn't have one.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. Nothing else from me.
The sort of the group, the proto-orthodoxy that's in charge, it's not that they are just using all kinds of different texts and they're not sure what's what, and it's also not the case that they have an established canon, but it's somewhere in between, where there is evidently a distinction between those texts that are deemed authoritative and those that are deemed heretical and that they're confiscating and burning, because otherwise the Edict of Thessalonica wouldn't really have any import with regard to the texts. And so clearly there was already some idea of which texts are heretical and which ones aren't, but we don't actually have a canon established at this point. And so then in the Council of Constantinople, which is 1 year later, called by Roman Emperor Theodosius, so same guy who did the edict, together with Gregory Nazianzus, Archbishop of Constantinople. Remember, that's the city that was established in the Byzantine Empire, so this sort of Eastern Rome. They attempted to unify all of Christianity under the imperial powers of Rome and the Byzantine Empire. So this was a thing that had been going on. So with like the Council of Nicaea, sort of when it first began, but it wasn't all unified yet. And then when the Edict of Thessalonica came about, they were like, okay, let's basically make all these people who aren't conforming to the one unified form of Christianity, like they're deemed the enemy. And now the Council of Constantinople is when this is like, I guess, officially established. So whether you want to say it was 325 at Nicaea or 381 at the Council of Constantinople, or whether it was sort of a progression that began at Nicaea and came to its culmination in Constantinople, however you want to look at that, that was clearly sort of the trajectory of what was going on at this point. And then we have the Theodosian Code, which again, it's Emperor Theodosius. Christianity maintained state power under Theodosius, who outlaws paganism and establishes laws separating Christianity from its Jewish roots. So here again, this is like as I said, it's like the final stage of this development, where now we have Christianity that's entirely married to the state power under the emperor, and that all other forms of Christianity are deemed heretical, and they're like trying to burn their books and like end those movements altogether. So there's only one Christianity, and it's this state approved, married under the emperor form of Christianity. And not only are they saying that you can't be any other form of Christian other than the state form of Christianity, but they're also outlawing any form of paganism. So they're also against all the Greco-Roman religions, and they're also establishing laws separating Christianity from Judaism. So even to this point, at the end of the 4th century, we have a lot of Christianity, especially sort of the existing Ebionite forms of Christianity, that are very much identifying still as Jewish. And they're still celebrating Jewish holidays with the Jewish people who aren't Christians. And like, you know, there's not this stark dividing line in like those forms of Christianity. But now with the Theodosian Code, they're like, you know, if either you're a Christian or you're a Jew. And if you're not conforming to the state form of Christianity, then we're going to label you Jewish and treat you as such. And like, so basically very demarcated. Christianity is the state religion, and if you're not conforming to the state version of Christianity, you're one of these other religions that you don't have the right to exist, basically. So we went from this Edict of Milan, where everyone can basically practice any religion that they want in 313, to now Constantinople and the Theodosian Code by the end of the 4th century. That's basically like, if you're not subscribing to the state form of Christianity, the official religion of the Roman Empire, then you can't practice your religion, essentially. So that all happened in the 4th century.
Mm-hmm.
And then guess what happened 2 years later? The Bible canon was established at the Council of Carthage under the influence of Augustine, including the New Testament, Apocrypha, and the Old Testament. So this was the immediate context of the establishment of the Bible canon that we have today. So the Gospel canon of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John being the 4 authoritative Gospels, that goes back to Irenaeus at the end of the 2nd century. But then the Bible itself was established by Augustine at the end of the 4th century here. And
so
basically there's
a council then, go ahead, sorry. So then basically a council under the influence of Augustine put together the Old Testament, the Bible canon itself, the whole Bible canon. the New and Old Testaments? This is where it was born.
So this is when it was officially established. But I
Or
can give you some
established.
details about the origin of the different parts of how it was established. So Augustine was the main person or at least he's treated as he's the main person who was kind of in charge of officially making this decision. But what he did, and there's clear attestations of this, because fortunately at the end of the 4th century, we have good records that exist. And he even says why he made certain decisions that he made. So for instance, one of the texts that we've talked about before is the Book of Enoch. That was something that had sort of fallen out of favor within Judaism, but it was still a central text that Christians were using. And so Augustine had to make a decision. Well, what do I do with the Book of Enoch? Well, I can't put it in the New Testament because it's not New Testament. And so do I put it in the Old Testament or do I omit it altogether? And he says, the reason I'm excluding the Book of Enoch is because Rabbinic Judaism at this time has omitted it from its canon, and therefore we're just going to adopt the Rabbinic Judaism canon for the Old Testament. And so that was where he got the Old Testament. And then the New Testament, he used Athanasius's proposed canon. And Athanasius, I believe it was in the 360s, that he was the one who proposed the canon, that Augustine just used his canon exactly and didn't make any changes. So it's not that Augustine was the one picking and choosing which books to include in. He was the guy who said, we're going to go with Athanasius, his canon for the New Testament. We're going to go with Rabbinic Judaism for the Old Testament canon.
Okay. So these canons already existed of sorts. He just put them together.
Yeah, he's the one who established them as the official canon so that then it can
canon.
Enforce this like Theodosius Code and, the Edict of Thessalonica, and basically
right.
Now it's not like a guessing game as to like, well, what should we do with the infancy Gospel of James that so many people love? And it was the origin of the birth story that's part of canonical Matthew and canonical Luke. It's like, all right, it's not included, burn it. It's like, what? Why are we burning the birth story that like now we just have the shorter version in the one that's like treated as the authoritative doctrine? It's like, doesn't all make sense. There's political reasons for things, but they had to draw a line somewhere for political reasons, and those are where they chose to draw the lines. But I think one of the main takeaways that I would like you and maybe anyone else who's watching this to get out of this is that the Bible canon was not established like when Jesus ascended up into heaven. Like a book didn't come down and land in Peter's hands and it's like, this is the holy book, perfect and complete. Like it was something that was, 400 years, almost 400 years, like 4 centuries in the making, and had a lot to do with the different forms of Christianity that it developed out of, and all these different councils. And there's a lot of things that went into the establishment of this. And so it was definitely a major development in church history, but it was also a product largely of a lot of the things that occurred in these first 4 centuries.
What has always sort of struck me as wrong is that the Jewish people, God's chosen people, were excluded from this process entirely. It seems. It's, the Greeks and the Romans, and they're the ones making all the decisions now. They've separated away from Judaism. To me, it feels like something really significant is lost in the canon we have.
And even not just like necessarily the canon, because he was like, well, we're just going to use the Rabbinic Judaism canon. So he's kind of like defaulting to their authority and that. But I would say maybe like the understanding of what those texts mean, or when for instance, if you're reading Paul and you're reading Jesus, like the things that Jesus says in the Gospels, and you're reading the Epistle of James, and like you're trying to understand like what's in the New Testament. If you are completely divorced from like Judaism, like how are you going to understand the Old Testament? And then how are you going to understand all these references that are made? Because like this is Jewish Christianity, like all these texts in Christianity are from the first century when, you know, Christianity was Jewish, almost entirely Jewish. And it's like in order to understand what's going on in the texts, you have to have some understanding of like what was going on in the Old Testament. And so, like you were saying, if we divorce ourselves from that, it's like we're kind of divorcing ourselves from our own foundation.
That, yeah, you say that very well, and that's exactly what I was thinking, in the sense that, you know, it's, you put it into the right words and form that, but it's you know, the Jewish people and the calendar and the traditions from, you know, that were handed down from their understanding of what Yahweh was doing, and what his, you know, what he was doing with the people. Um, I brought up Brad Scott to you before, and I've been watching his videos again. He's a Messianic Jewish teacher. I'm listening to the Mind of the Messiah right now, and so much different. It's a different way of thinking altogether. The Jewish thinking was cyclical. Greek thinking is linear. Uh, there's so much that is lost because we don't understand that culture and how God was working in a cyclical fashion. I don't mean to get us off track. Just to point that out, that it just seems that there's so much that is lost, that it feels important to recover it in order to really understand what God was doing and how he teaches people, you know. Anyway.
Yeah, and also like that you were mentioning the cyclical way of reading like Jewish history and the Jewish texts. It's like if you don't get that way of reading the Torah as like a not a straightforward linear history, but rather as a text that you're supposed to read as a cyclical text that gives you more and more information to piece together about the same event that happened. But if you're just reading it as a chronological thing from beginning to end, you're going to have this very different understanding of who the God of the Torah is supposed to be. And so I think like that does lead to a lot of sort of wrong views. And that's, I think we see that in a very pronounced way in the second century when they're like, well, this God of the Old Testament must be some evil demiurge. And it's like, well, yeah, because you don't know how to read the Jewish literature. You're divorcing yourself from your foundation.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, go to James. He'll tell you how to interpret the Torah. He understands it. But if we're rejecting James and calling him an apostate, and it's like, yeah, we're anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think I agree with you.
Yep.
All right, so the next one is the Council of Chalcedon. So to me, I think this was about as significant as Nicaea or Constantinople. To me, this is like the third major like turning point at this point. So these three councils were really big. And at Chalcedon, it was called by the Roman Emperor Marcian, not to be confused with Marcion of the second century. So totally different guy, 300 years later. He favored Rome and Constantinople churches, which were more yoked to his state power, and by force broke up ecclesial authority of Alexandria and Antioch churches. The theological divide was supposedly over Christ's nature, to what extent he was fully man and fully God, but the real reason for the split was likely the refusal to acknowledge Marcion's imperial authority over the church. So remember, I said that there were these four major sort of most influential churches in the world at this point. You had Alexandria, Antioch, Constantinople, and Rome. Well, now what Marcion is trying to do is he's trying to break up this ecclesial authority of Alexandria and Antioch. So he's trying to depose their bishops and install the bishops that will basically favor his authority. And they were resisting, and so he was basically trying to like undermine their authority to where he could basically take over the whole church and have even more influence and power over it. And they were resisting. And so what ended up happening was they divided, and the Church of Constantinople and the Church of Rome sort of followed Marcion, and then Alexandria, Antioch, and all the other churches split off and went in their own direction. And they say that it was because they couldn't agree on Christ's nature. And this was like Miaphysitism and whatever. And it's in hindsight, you have people who are like trying to understand even what the difference is between the two terms that they couldn't agree on, and it's like so convoluted that it's essentially totally incredible to think that that was the reason that they split. But as we'll see, the trajectory of these kind of splits, they'll be blamed on a theological divide, but it's almost certainly due to a political power struggle that they divided. And so even today, you have people on both sides of this debate trying to understand what the difference is between these two views that they were divided over regarding Christ's nature, and they still can't even pick out what the difference is. It's just purely a semantic thing, essentially. It's like, do you want to say that Christ is one with two natures, or Christ is like has two natures in one? And it's like, that's the same thing. It's like, yeah, but you're phrasing it in a different way. It's like, okay.
Semantic.
Yeah, but so then this was the major split. And so what occurred was you have Rome and Constantinople basically marrying itself, remaining married to the emperor, but now you have all these other churches that are now essentially divorcing themselves from the authority of the state. And those are what's known as the Oriental Orthodox churches. So they remain in communion with each other, just these other churches that broke off. And just to name them, the Alexandrian Antioch churches, along with it seems all other churches other than Rome and Constantinople, continue to practice Nicene Christianity, and today are known as the Oriental Orthodox churches, which include Coptic Orthodox Church of Alexandria, Syriac Orthodox Church, Armenian Apostolic Church, Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, Eritrean Orthodox Tewahedo Church, and Malankara Orthodox Syrian Church. To this day, they continue to reject Chalcedon, refusing to be yoked to the imperial powers. Also to this day, the Chalcedonian churches have yet to regret their decision to yoke themselves to the imperial powers of Rome. So basically, these handful of churches were like, okay, we've had enough. We want nothing to do with you're just amping it up further and further and further, where the emperor and the state have more and more influence over the church, and we've had enough. We're not going along with it anymore. We're breaking off. And so then Rome and Constantinople were like, okay, fine. You guys are heretics. You're breaking off. We'll do this ourselves. And so then you had Rome and Constantinople going in one direction, and the rest of the churches going in this other direction.
So maybe you can explain at this juncture why it is that so many Catholics think they are following Peter at this point. Peter established the church. Today, that's what they think, even though this history has not even mentioned Peter.
Well, we started in post-biblical times, so they would be usually referring to the place where Jesus says, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And he says, "No flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven revealed it to you. And on this rock I will build my church." Well, he also says, "Get behind me, Satan," but that's we'll pretend he didn't say that. But he says, "I'm building my rock on this church." And so they usually reference that as Peter being the first pope. And even though the actual term pope did not come about until much later, I think maybe it was a 4th century term. But basically the bishop of Rome, which later became a pope, So he would be like the first bishop of Rome, the Church of Rome, and they're saying, well, the Church of Rome has been like the primary church from the beginning, but that's sort of anachronistic, where you're rewriting history according to like where you're at and tracing where you're at now back to where you believe you began. And so if you're just trying to trace a straight line, then what you'll do as we get to the divide, once the Greek Orthodox Constantinople Church divides away from the Roman Catholic Church. So you have like this church in Rome that then is like the Chalcedon, and then before that it's Nicene, and before that it goes all the way back to Peter. So if you start with any of these churches, you can trace yourself back to Jesus, because, well, Jesus was the beginning, and it all sort of fractured away from that as time moved on. So everyone has a claim to being the true church. And so the Catholic Church, they would say, well, see, we were always the ones that were in the right, and everyone else were the heretics that broke away from us. And so here at Chalcedon, when Rome and Constantinople break away from all the other churches, well, they're saying, well, all the other churches became the heretics, and it was only us in Constantinople that were still had that real lineage, or that real authority.
Mm-hmm.
But then every other church would basically say the same thing about themselves. Does that make sense how that would work?
Yeah. Yep, it does.
Okay, so now that was the third major sort of thing, the third council that took place. But then shortly thereafter, about 25 years later, the Roman Empire fell. And so now we have basically the Byzantine Empire survives. Now the Roman Catholic Church still exists. It's just now under sort of barbarian control instead of the previous control. So it still continues. But then there's this interesting thing that takes place. So we say, at this time in the East, the Byzantine Empire maintained stable control over the East for 1,000 years after the Roman Empire fell. They acknowledged the Pope as head of the Western Chalcedonian Church, whose headquarters was Rome, but not as head of the Eastern Chalcedonian Greek Orthodox Church, whose headquarters was Constantinople. So there was still this sort of, they were still in communion with each other, Rome and Constantinople, but they acknowledged their own sort of separate, independent kind of authority. They are what would be known as like autonomous.
Mm-hmm. So then you have the Roman Catholic versus the Greek Orthodox.
We don't have that divide yet. Like they're acknowledging as a distinction between each other, but they're still in communion as like they wouldn't refer to themselves as Chalcedonian, but like, yeah, they're still like one group, and the Oriental Orthodox is the other group.
Okay.
They haven't divided yet, but they will soon.
Okay. All right. So it's the beginning, basically, just that they're distinct, that they're making a distinction is the beginning of the divide, basically. So, okay.
Yeah, the main thing that's going on here is that there's all these political things going on where, you know, I'm just sort of giving you the history from the church perspective, but there's all kinds of like political stuff and wars and, you know, countries coming into existence and being taken over. Like that's just the nature of like the landscape of the world. And so we're just kind of touching on things that are occurring that are impacting the church. And so at this point, I'm just pointing out that the barbarians are now taking over Rome, and not the Constantinople Byzantine Empire part. They are staying intact, but now Rome is sort of now the barbarians are in control.
Yeah. I just think it's interesting that they'd have the Pope is the head of the Western Chalcedonian Church, but not head of the Eastern Chalcedonian Church.
Yeah, and that's and the only reason that it's the Pope is because the Roman Catholic Church decided to call their bishop a pope, and we'll talk about why that is a little bit later. I guess we could talk about it now. So they have a different ecclesial structure than all the other churches. So the other churches, they'll have a bishop who's like the main person making the decision over the church, but then they'll have like a council of, I think it's an archbishop as a head, and then there's like all the other bishops of the individual churches are like in a council sort of committee under this bishop, and the head bishop, even though he's sort of the chair, it's almost like the House of Representatives, where it's like you have that House chair, but his vote only counts as one. All the other people's votes also count as one. So he's like one vote, but like head one vote kind of. Whereas the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope has absolute authority, and all the other sort of cardinals or bishops or whatever it is underneath him have no authority. So it's a very different power structure in Rome than it is in Constantinople in terms of the churches. Okay. So the Pope has way more authority over the Church of Rome than the Bishop of Constantinople has over the Church of Constantinople. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah.
All right. But they still, like the Council of Bishops in Constantinople have the authority over Constantinople. The Pope of Rome does not have the authority over the Church of Constantinople, though. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so then just this last thing here, the Henoticon proposal under Emperor Zeno attempted to reconcile the schism and to omit Chalcedon from church history, but Rome rejected this attempt and impeached communion with all the bishops of the East who signed the proposal. So basically, there was an emperor who was trying to make peace and say, hey, the church divided in Chalcedon, where now we have the two churches, Rome and Constantinople, on one side. We have all the other churches on the other side. Can we maybe come back together? And both sides were like, nope. So, yeah, that didn't work. And then in the 6th century, we had the Assyrian church split off, which I just wanted to add that because it's there. And then we have in the year 610, or the early 7th century, is the emergence of Islam. So that's another kind of thing that affects history.
Mm-hmm. I don't understand Islam really at all. I know it's what I do know about it is the way there's and again, I'm probably not going to get this theologically. There's this peaceful Islam, and then there's the side we see that in Gaza and other areas, the warring factions that really are not. They call themselves Islamics, but the actual Islam itself, the religion, is peaceful, from what I understand.
I mean, like the name, the word Islam means peace, so it's supposed to be peace. But as we'll see with the continuation of Christian church history doesn't look any less violent than Islamic history. So that's
didn't they at one time, we already went through this portion of the history, but back further from where we're at now, there was a time when they actually tried to kill all of the Christians, didn't they? Rome,
the Church of Rome tried to do that.
No, well, maybe it wasn't Rome, but somewhere, and I heard this somewhere, they tried to kill all Christians, and I don't know who they were. That's just the thing. I don't know.
Well, we'll be talking about that. I think this is probably a good place to stop, because I think we're about halfway through, and we're almost an hour and a half in. So maybe next time we could pick up with like the sort of medieval period in the 11th century. But yeah, that is sort of a good segue to what we're going to be looking into, because at this point, there were persecutions, there were political power struggles, there were doctrinal difficulties. But once we get to like the 11th century, that's when we start to see major things like crusades and pogroms and things of that nature. And so we sort of the violence definitely steps it up to the next level, and we're going to see a lot about that. We're not going to be talking about really Islam, because I just wanted to point out that like this is when Islam began, because it's an important development, like tangentially to Christian church history, because
Sure.
some people think, oh, Islam that existed at the time of the beginning of Christianity. It's like, no, it didn't. And like some people think, oh, well, that was a more recent thing. Well, let's just like, here it is. This is when it occurred. It's the early 7th century. So I just want to
Okay.
kind of add that to the timeline so we have an idea of how that's related.
Where it fits in. Right.
Right. So over all this stuff that we kind of went over today, um, what's something that stood out to you that you would say would be like a significant thing that sort of impacted the trajectory of church history?
Well, the biggest thing is the Council of Nicaea. I mean,
How
all of
come?
it is important. Well, because it's when the Emperor Constantine became the official decision maker over the church, in a sense. It was no longer the bishops. He gathered the bishops together and decided to have this council to determine what the true, what the, you don't, again, like you had said, he didn't care what they decided, just that they decide what the official stance of the Christian church is going to be, because that is going to be the church. He took over. He decided that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd say that was definitely a major point in church history. And I would say Chalcedon, at least like the split off of the Oriental Orthodox churches, where it's almost like they kind of had enough and they're like, all right, we've done this for a little over 100 years. We're not liking where things are going. Like we're
Mm-hmm.
not on board with amping it up to the next level. We see that split. And I think even the council at Constantinople was almost like sort of the natural trajectory of like, once we made that decision, I say once the church made that decision at Nicaea to sort of marry itself to the imperial powers of the state, then I think the Council of Constantinople was essentially inevitable. Like that was the natural trajectory of the way things were going to go. And then I think Chalcedon was sort of the breaking point where it was like, that's sort of the point of no return, if you will. And so
Mm-hmm.
Chalcedon was like, yeah, that's where I think Rome and Constantinople went in a very different direction than the Oriental Orthodox churches from that point on.
I think there's another important part. It happens a much further back, and that's when Christianity becomes separated from its Jewish roots.
Hmm.
Wherever that is and however that took place. And it sounds like we don't have like a very specific timeline as to exactly when that happened. It sounds like there's a lot that went into that happening. But back to what we talked about a little earlier, which was, we no longer follow the biblical calendar. We no longer follow the holy days. We don't. This all got divorced from what it means to be Christian, but it didn't get divorced from what God was trying to do in instructing and teaching His people. So something very significant happened there. And so sometimes I truly feel like the scripture that we have, the Bible that we have, the way that we are practicing it, it's missing a significant piece of its foundation.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it's like going back to that is what we need to do. So go back to that, because that's the foundation. The foundation has to be reestablished.
Yeah, I think that in the 2nd century, we see some very marked differences emerging between Christianity and Judaism, depending on whichever of the groups that you're identifying with. I know with the Ebionites, you are identifying as Jewish, and so there wouldn't be much of a divide at all. Maybe the division would be more on the Jewish side of like the non-Christians, where they're trying to maybe push away some of the Ebionites, thinking, well, stop preaching Jesus, or you're not part of our fellowship. Whereas with some of the other groups like the Marcionites, they are definitely pushing against like Judaism, identifying as like a non-Jewish group. And so we definitely see it, and especially with the proto-Orthodoxy, where they'll start using terms like Judaizing, and well, I guess Paul, used that term, but they would really sort of run with that and use that as one of their major ways of differentiating. And so I think it's definitely a process, like a development of like the schism, where we could tell that like in the 4th century, there's like this clear divide where it breaks apart, and like at least the imperial form of, the state-run Christianity is decidedly not Jewish. So it's like definitely divorced by that point. But then it's like in the 2nd century, if you look at the Ebionites, for instance, like they're definitely not divorced. So it's like the divorce had to have occurred sometime between those 2 points. But then where between those 2 points is not super clear.
Right.
And it kind of depends on which form of Christianity your particular view aligns with, I guess.
Right. You can't pinpoint a time frame, but also some of the details of the schism or the separation also, or the transition away from Judaism gets obscure. Which makes me think about, okay, for during the whole period of the Torah and all the way up until Christ comes, and even afterward during the first few, maybe century or two, you do have Judaism, you do have the church being established on the in the Hebrew sense, okay, which was, to me, it seems like that's what God intended, and then it seems like there's some point where you have Greeks and Romans taking over, and they make it something totally different. Am I wrong? I mean, that's what I'm seeing happening.
Well, you're not wrong, but I just want to add that it's a little more complicated, because there's this term that's known as Hellenization, which is basically, people would say it began with Alexander the Great, where he's basically trying to take over the world and dominate the entire world, not doing so by necessarily having dominion over it and having like the entire world be Macedonia, but rather he's trying to influence his own culture, this Greek culture, on the world. And this Hellenization process sort of, especially throughout the diaspora, which is like all the Jewish people spread out throughout the world, not just those living in Judea, where it's especially pronounced among them, who are they're living in these Hellenized cultures. And it's like, well, how can you be completely separate from your culture that you're living in? And so this Hellenization process means that even within Judaism, we have these pressures to conform to these Hellenistic ideas and conforming to Greek Platonic philosophies, where you have all these doctrines that come from Greek philosophy that sort of infiltrate into both forms of Judaism and into forms of Christianity. And so it can kind of be complicated on multiple levels as to where these pressures to like become more Hellenized or more Greek and less Jewish. But then you have groups like the Ebionites, who are like, I think very clearly the biggest, sort of staunchest, like, I guess, preservers of the Jewish element, and like the least influenced by this Greek culture. And so within them, I think you get the clearest picture of like what Jesus and the apostles were believing and practicing, and just like how how much they are very much Hebrew and very much not sort of Greek.
Brad Scott teaches in that fashion. So, yeah, I really like his teaching. I'm reacquainting myself with it. He's Jewish, so he understands the culture. He understands Jewish history really well, and he's messianic. So he believes in Christ as Jesus is the deity of, he is God incarnate. So fascinating teaching. Anyway, I didn't mean to get off track again, but it kind of isn't. It's all part of it. I think that's what we just said. I think is probably even more significant than 325 or anything that happened in history, because as you're saying, there's this increasing takeover of what Yahweh and Christ came to establish and what the Ebionites were trying to preserve towards this Hellenization. And that has to be the most significant piece to me, that this happens. And we have all these factions, and we just have this totally scattered church, when it was supposed to be one.
Yeah, and Israel was supposed to be one too.
Exactly. Israel,
And there was
the nation, the nation Israel, yeah.
And so,
yeah.
As we'll see whenever we get to second century Christianity and start focusing on some of these groups in particular, I think it'll become clearer sort of where the commonalities and where the differences are. And it'll also be clear that not everyone within Judaism, especially in the first century, had the same views as each other. So there were different sort of groups within Judaism too. There were the Sadducees in control of the temple. There were the Pharisees who were in control of the legal structures and the Sanhedrin. And you had these Essene sort of monastic prophets. And you had these zealots who were these sort of revolutionary people who wanted to get rid of Roman occupation. And so those were some of the major sort of different groups within first century Judaism. So Judaism wasn't necessarily unified either. And then there was also, with these different groups, and even within these different groups, there were different readings of the Tanakh and the Torah. And even the Sadducees didn't even accept any of the prophetic texts. They only accepted the Torah. And that there were different readings of what the correct version of the Torah was and what the right reading of it was, and who should be in power. Should it be the priests and the kings and the lawyers, or should it be the prophets? Who's supposed to be in power in God's eyes? And so there's all kinds of questions, even just within first century and earlier Judaism, sort of as the backdrop to the emergence of first century Christianity. So I don't think there's any one easy kind of answer to any of this, but I think the more we sort of look at some of the major developments of things that were going on and understanding what people were believing and teaching, and we can kind of get a better sense of the trajectory of how things got from where they were to what they are today. And then I think the more important question that you were alluding to is, well, then how should this knowledge impact our beliefs and practices today?
Exactly. Right? Yeah. I was just going to say that, because we're really looking for, as Scripture teaches us to seek Yahweh and what He wants, and make that, that's the goal, seeking Yahweh and living as closely as possible to what He intended.
Well, that's also not a universally accepted position either within Judaism or early Christianity.
But it isn't within early Christianity either? I mean, what Jesus came to do, that's what Jesus taught.
Well, we'll talk about that when we start looking at some of the Ebionite literature and we'll see if that's the case. There's
Okay.
certainly some understandings that there's a difference between you're saying Yahweh, some say Adonai is like the Lord, but there's a different views on, well, Elohim and Adonai aren't referring to the same character. And so, for instance, in the Marcionites and in the Sethians, especially in the Sethians, they have this view of Yaldabaoth, who they believe was the evil creator demiurge. So they believe that this Adonai character wasn't actually the real God. And then we have this Ebionite view that there's this way of reading the Torah in which there's a difference between when Elohim is mentioned and when Adonai is mentioned, and that if you're going to read it correctly, then you might land in a different place than what you just suggested. So we'll be talking about some of those things that certainly, like I said, complicate it. But I think looking into these things, the more we look into it, the more knowledgeable we become, and the better decisions that we can make as well.
Okay. I won't hang on to that. What I said, I'm open to, further understanding for sure. It's just still, but we're supposed to emulate Christ, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeshua.
That's right.
And so Yeshua came to do his Father's will and his Father's will only.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so if we're supposed to emulate that, then we're supposed to be seeking the Father as Jesus did, to do his will and his will only.
Yep. So the question is he the son of Adonai, or is he the son of Elohim? And if he's Emmanuel, then he's the son of Elohim. But if he is the son of Adonai, then
which some think,
does that put him at the left hand of God or the right hand of God?
Well,
it's not a question I'm expecting you to answer right now. I'm just throwing it out there as a sort of rhetorical question, saying, well, these are some of the questions that they're asking in 2nd century and 1st century Christianity.
You're introducing me to something that I was unaware of, this Adonai being an evil character. Mm-hmm. So I already have rejected that, and I should not, I cannot see Yeshua coming from being evil. There's no evil in him. So,
right.
I mean, how does a person even open their mind to learn these things when we're taught that it's blasphemy to question some of that stuff, even, Jesus or Yeshua being the Son of God, being, he's all good. Mm-hmm. He's, yeah.
It's really interesting stuff. I think pretty much all forms of Christianity believe that Jesus is good and that he comes from like the Father, but who they interpret the Father as being differs. So, for instance, if you ask a Sethian or a Marcionite, they might tell you that he's coming from the good Father, but the good Father isn't the one who created the world. An evil demiurge created the world, but Jesus is the son of the good Father, and he came us to redeem us from the creator of the world. And it's like, well, okay, that's one view. And then you would have another view that says, no, he came from his Father, who was the God of the Hebrew Bible, and that it's all one God in the Hebrew Bible. But then there'd be another view that says, well, you have to read the Hebrew Bible in the right way to pick out which things are from the real God and which ones are not from the real God, whether it's from the lying pen of the scribe or whether it's a feature of the text. They are supposed to discern this. But then we get traces of this even from the Ebionite literature, that they say all things that were said against our God, even in the Tanakh, we reject those things that are said about him. So they're not accepting everything that's written about God in the Tanakh. So we have these different views within early Christianity, and trying to trace back which ones go back to Jesus and the apostles is its own complicated thing too. But I just kind of wanted to point that out because at every turn there's complications.
Well, and if you go back to Genesis, God created. It says God. So are we talking about Adonai created the world? Then this evil deity in Genesis creating the world? Is that what they think? It's interesting.
Some yes, and some no. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a whole foray into like when you start reading like Nag Hammadi texts and understanding what these groups were believing and teaching, and then you start reading some of the existent literature from, say, the Ebionites, and just trying to piece it all together, what they were believing. It's kind of interesting. I find it interesting just to see all the different forms, and especially how that eventually resulted in what we have as like the gospel canon and the New Testament and like the Christian doctrines of like the 4th century and onward. And it's like, oh, cool. So this is where they got these things and these ideas. And like, I mean, I of course have some things to say about what I think is right and what I think is wrong, but I think from a purely historical perspective, just pointing out what the different views are, there's definitely some complicated things going on there.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Looking forward to the next session.
Awesome. All right, so I think this is a good place to stop. Maybe I could close us in prayer.
All right.
All right. Our Father in heaven, thank you for this time to study and look at this history. And we just pray that you continue to guide us in our conversations and as we go over some of this material and just learn more about how things got from where they began to where they are today. And most importantly, we just ask for your guidance in like what we're supposed to do today, what we're supposed to believe and practice to be most glorifying to you. And we just thank you for this friendship that Kathy and I have, and that we can dive into some of this material and just really examine it and gain a better understanding of history and where everything comes from. So we just pray this all in your son, Jesus' name. Emmanuel. Amen.
Emmanuel. Amen. God is with us.